From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. During our first half hour today, we'll be joined by K-State's Ted Schroeder and Glynn Tonsor. They'll take a close look at the state of the beef packing industry, which is, of course, under extreme duress from the closures caused by the coronavirus outbreak. Specifically, they'll respond to questions that have arisen about the structure of the packing sector and whether packer concentration is contributing to the interruption in overall meat supply flow. They'll also comment on how the disruptions relate to market price discovery, as that would affect livestock sellers. Following today's agricultural news headlines, then, the weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas with K-State's Gus Vanderhoven. All that here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Welcome once again. Well, on this segment of the broadcast, we want to visit the topic that has cropped up here of late with the concerns over packing plant closures in the meat industry, some of the troubles that has brought to bear for cattle producers, for the industry in a broader context. And in turn, this has brought up questions about the structure of the meat packing industry and whether changes should be made in the future relevant to the COVID-19 problems that have arisen recently. We brought in a couple of individuals who are very well studied and well versed in the subject of the structure of the beef supply chain in particular, from producer to retail. We're joined by K-State livestock economists Ted Schroeder and Glynn Tonsor. Well, Ted, let's begin with you and your general take on the severity of the plant closures, the duration of the impact that this might bring on the beef cattle sector. This is serious business, of course.
It for sure is, Eric. We're in a situation which I don't think our industry or our society has ever really faced and realized the challenges associated with an event like this. You know, it's not only the fact that we've got all of the industry challenge going on of trying to understand how to coordinate a supply chain that's undergone immense disruption, but now, you know, dealing with the critical values around human life and human health. And those are all integrated into the complexity of then trying to figure out how to make markets work in those kinds of environments. And that's what we're in the midst of. And it's why it doesn't have simple, easy solutions. And it's something that's going to take quite a bit of time to work through. And especially we know with a beef pipeline, beef supply chain, where animals start to get backed up, which clearly happens as we start slowing down chain speeds because of reduced labor availability. We start closing plants or have had plant closures. You know, and combined, then the animal's still gaining, and we've got to do something with it. We've got to move it. We've got to keep it flowing. And on the other end, you've got consumer demand that, you know, is quite uncertain, but certainly changed from a food service to a retail setting. And so you've got all of these things happening at the same time, and somehow trying to figure out how to coordinate and how to have a market that can still function and still move product that's perishable through the system. So you've got all this happening, and then, you know, each segment of the industry trying to fulfill their role as best they can. And I think in a nutshell, that's about the best way I can describe sort of an industry under a lot of stress. And of course, not just this industry, as I mentioned, it's broad, it's across society as well.
And Glynn, it appears that plants will be getting back online gradually. That's the intent and the hope here, looking forward to the next several days. But in terms of the injury to the industry, that's going to be spelled out over quite a bit of time, isn't it?
Yes. I don't think we even know the full severity of that at this stage. I'm hopeful that we're towards the worst of it in terms of lost capacity. We're running, actually, cattle and hog processing is about 40% lower than it was same week this time last year. So we're running at something like 60% of desired volumes for context. There's some hope that might be as low as we go. Obviously, I share that hope. We can't guarantee. But afterwards, so tomorrow, next week, a month from now, and depending on how far we want to go from this, maybe 2 decades from now, we'll circle around to why I'm saying that, I think we're going to have aftermath from this. So what I want to impress on folks, to add to what Ted has shared, is this is a very integrated flow of animals and meat products. Lots of different decisions had to be made. Lots of it has perishability components, which is different than something that's not perishable. That changes the ability to do this. And I give a serious pause on trying to make adjustments to get through now in much of a survival sense that also become permanent changes for the future. It's my 2-decade kind of comment. So in general, a doctor, when you have a procedure, will give you advice on what to do when you go home for the next hour or 2 weeks or whatever, depending upon the surgery or medicine involved, but doesn't tell you to quit exercising the rest of your life. There's a duration in the prescription, so to speak. And I encourage listeners of this to separate what might be necessary or quote unquote desired to respond to help us deal with this challenge, now the crisis in the middle of the challenge, from what we want a food system to be in the future. I'm not sure those are the same thing, but a lot of discussions in the media are trying to connect them. And I think that's dangerous and runs the risk of being an overreaction.
And that leads to our core item here. That is, the COVID situation has rekindled the calls, by some anyway, for action away from concentration in the meatpacking industry. And this time it's being expressed on the basis of food supply security, to put it that way. Now, packer concentration in and of itself is a rather well-studied topic, isn't it, Ted?
Well, it's nothing new. You know, in the beef industry in particular, where we've got approximately, under normal times, 80% of the slaughter volume being managed by 4 companies. That's been the case for a couple of decades now, approximately. Been different companies who have been sitting in those seats over the time frame, but really the essence of the market structure as we see it today has been in place for quite a while, and it really hasn't changed that much. I think what we instead kind of view or see is kind of the things Glynn was talking about, the day-to-day, week-to-week kinds of ebbing and flowing of a market environment. And I think it's important to realize that, you know, the structure that's there has been there for a while. We do see it ebb and flow, and we do see leverage swing at different times and places throughout the sector. And that goes from cow-calf to feedlot to packer to processor, even to retailer and food service. And it's an issue that has been around a while. We've studied it a lot. We try to understand and evaluate and monitor it ongoingly. And I think we always are looking at both short-run leverage swings, but also longer-run how and why the structure is what it is, how and why the structures are changing at different segments of the industry. Not as much at packing, but certainly have occurred elsewhere. But you know, just understanding what's causing that and what the drivers are and how we ended up where we are today.
And to that point, Glynn, why we see concentration to the degree that it exists today, why it has been in place for quite some time. There are sound economic fundamentals at work here, you say.
Yes. Whether you're talking cow-calf or all the way to the retail sector, every of the nodes, and we're highlighting the packing and processing sector here, but all of those different stages have what economists would call economies of scale. And in non-jargon terms, that simply means that if we can run at higher volumes, we do so at a lower cost per animal or per pound, right? If we're on live animal or meat units, ultimately consumers certainly benefit from that. If you have lower operating costs, that's a lower price at the end of the day for consumers. And in general, economists would associate that with a more efficient system. That's well documented. We can debate exactly how steep those economies of scale are and so forth, but that's a core driver why we have the systems we have in place. And a lot of this has to do with fixed cost, administrative oversight, safety protocols, those kind of things. When you divide them by a larger number of animals, the cost per animal or pound goes down. That's economic concept point one. What I would add to this, so that comment isn't new. I mean, that's got decades of legs to it at this point, is the role of exports to the viability of the U.S. ag sector has grown notably in the last couple decades. And we'll bring it specifically to the livestock sector, is all major species, and this includes beef cattle, are becoming more focused on exports pre-COVID as a way to grow and sustain the current size of their industry. And I think that's important and not getting noticed in this discussion, but yet as the economist, one of the two economists in this discussion, I have to highlight is we often talk about the economy as a scale component to reduce cost, which is very accurate. But equally important is that scale enables one to sort of specialize and fulfill a wider set of marketing opportunities. And I'm going to use the example of buyers from Japan interested in buying U.S. beef product. It's easier for them to do that if they can go to a source where they can fulfill their order as opposed to trying to have to go to 30 sources, right? I mean, I'm purposely not using company names here because I don't think we need to do that to make the point. But there's economic benefits because we market products, not whole animals, after the plant that are part of the story that probably have grown over the last couple of decades. And I was making a comment, we need to have some caution how we react in the midst of the crisis. I'm concerned among the consequences of a strong potential overreaction would be losing our global competitiveness, and it would not serve well for our stakeholders around the countryside.
Well, on that, we need to step away for a couple of moments, gentlemen, and then we'll return with more from K-State livestock economists Glynn Tonsor and Ted Schroeder as they're responding to, let's call them discussion points, over the structure and function of the meat packing industry as it's been disrupted by the coronavirus situation. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Keeping your distance from others is important in slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are some fun things to do alone. Read a book, take a walk, unpack your suitcase from that trip you took last September, paint a self-portrait, catch up on a TV series, do a puzzle. Remember, we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. And once more, we're joined by livestock economists Ted Schroeder and Glynn Tonsor of Kansas State University. We've invited them in to share their input on what's been happening with the meat processing industry, the beef packing sector in particular. Of course, as you know, those have felt the brunt of the coronavirus outbreak, numerous plants idled. This has prompted a re-examination of the structure and the function of the packing industry, at least in the public discourse so far. Invariably, as a topic associated with concentration, how concentration impacts cattle price discovery. And both of you, once again, have been involved in studying that particular issue over the years. What do we know in that realm?
Well, again, price discovery itself in fed cattle sector especially has overgone a remarkable transition in the last 5 to 7 years. And we've talked about this several times where we have had several regions that have had significant declines in negotiated trade on a week-to-week basis. That happened long before any of the current pandemic and COVID-19 stuff has occurred. That was a long-term process where especially places like Colorado and Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma markets basically moved away from negotiated pricing and moved into really formula pricing being the dominant marketing method. Now, areas north of here, Nebraska, Iowa, and to some extent still Kansas, negotiating a fair number of cattle week to week typically. But when you have sort of that transition occurring, and at the same time, you have this issue around plant closures, it accentuates where if a particular plant may close, and we saw that with the fire in the Holcomb plant last fall, that when a particular plant has a structural issue, and in this case, many plants are having these kinds of issues, we're not only challenging how are we discovering, is it cash negotiated or is it longer term formula kinds of arrangements, but we're also challenging the logistical where and when are those cattle going to be able to move through the system. You kind of have a compounding going on here, Eric, and that is part of what we're dealing with right now with the price discovery environment. Again, you can't simply go in and say, well, let's just go back to the way price discovery was in 2010, and let's make it be that today. It's not going to work very well to try to do that. In fact, you could really upset this thing even more. And instead, it comes back to saying, well, how did we get to where we are? Why have we evolved into the pricing and value system we have? And are there ways to take the current system and enhance our ability or enhance the information that we get or use from that system to help that system work more efficiently and effectively? And I think that's the critical thing to watch and think about as we go forward, is that the ways we're marketing and valuing cattle today have evolved because they offer great opportunity to increase the value signal sending in our industry. We just got to be cognizant of anything we do going forward has to maintain that. And another segment of that that's critical is risk management. And it's risk management not only to the cattle feeder, but also to the processor. And that managing of risk and ability to manage risk more effectively, it emanates both directions, all the way to the cow-calf producer and the prices they can get for calves, and all the way up to the consumer. So I think it's a really, really important topic you've brought up there. And it's one that I don't think we can simply just tweak with rules and regs. I think instead we've got to figure out ways to help what we've gained in terms of valuation and value discovery and make it more effective and transparent, perhaps, or more informationally rich.
Glynn?
The only thing I was going to add to that is there's always been this balance of what's the role in the private action of a buyer, private action of a seller, and a governmental component. And that has changed over time. I'll remind folks, I know you two know this, but some of our listeners, LMR, the mandatory price reporting, came about for multiple reasons. But among it was a concern of a desire to have more information flow. Some of that was after the 1998 hog challenges that are being talked about quite a bit currently as well. And that shifted and altered the amount of information flow and kind of the role of the government in this, providing info to buyers and sellers and so forth. Why am I highlighting that? I think it's totally natural that we pause, assess what is the relative role of private buyer, private seller, and some public governmental component here. But notice I said assess. I mean, I encourage us to assess, study, not forget the benefits of a system that's developed over time. There's probably always room for improvement. I support that. But I think it's very dangerous to jump off the cliff without studying what's on the other side, so to speak. And my gut tells me we're getting closer and closer to doing something like that at the risk of losing some of the reasons we got to where we are. It's rational during a survival stage to want strong action. I understand that. But I made an allusion or a comment about a 2-decade effect in my first remarks. That's what I'm concerned about, is that some of the things we do in the spirit of survival have notable long-term consequences that need to be thought about before we, quote-unquote, jump.
And to that point, and to wrap up here, once the dust settles on COVID, whenever that's going to be, will the packing industry adjust some to avert a similar setback in the future? Will we see some changes without sweeping modifications in the structure of the industry itself?
Ted noted this earlier, and I want to reinforce it because I think it's a really important point, is the linchpin of labor availability during a human pandemic is core to the current challenges. I mean, I think we knew that before, but it's very obvious now. I fully anticipate, regardless of ownership of plants and how many we have, that just economics of assessing how do we coordinate labor, better, differently, signal, on and on after the pandemic. There's going to be a lot of work in that space. While not always popular, part of that will be what pieces of that can we automate going forward to ease some of that human labor risk component in that system. I think that will be front and center in those decisions. And please take note, I think that will occur as long as there's private value in producing meat, which I anticipate there will be in the U.S. We'll be making those economic assessments.
Ted, thoughts?
I think if anything that we've learned, in addition to what Glynn's just noted, we've learned that you absolutely have to have flexibility built more robustly into our systems. I think we've learned that across all of our food, perishable food, especially supply chains. It's absolutely incredible, I think, to the typical consumer, let alone even the producer that's involved, to see products that might have to be destroyed when they're being harvested, whether it's a lettuce in California or whether it's hogs in Iowa and dumping milk in Wisconsin. I mean, these are things that are just sort of incredible to us in modern society. And while we can understand and rationalize and see why we're there, it also speaks very loudly to me that we need to figure out ways to develop systems that can be a little more adaptable. Let's hope we don't see this kind of a thing again the rest of our lives, the rest of history in the future. But nonetheless, we know that events are and do occur, and they have been, and they'll continue to, whether they're natural disasters or whether man-made or whatever they might be. And it really, really is teaching us the hard lesson that figuring out ways to be more adaptable, flexible, and being able to turn off and redirect and re-guide logistics, transportation, physical products, especially in these perishable spaces, is something we have got to get better at. And I do believe the industry it's nothing they don't realize. They see that. I think the critical thing is figuring out the most effective ways to do that while also meeting the challenges and the demands that Glynn mentioned earlier for the modern consumer, who really has high expectations around the world on product-specific attributes. So you got to, again, find a balance on those. But I think if we're going to do anything, we're going to invest more in trying to better understand how we make our systems adaptable more rapidly to these kinds of events. And I think it's already ongoing, but I think it's where a lot of our time, and some of that may indeed be substitution of capital for labor, as an example.
Valuable input, gentlemen, on a pivotal matter, highly pivotal for the future of the industry and where it heads post-COVID, that is the meat packing sector. And thanks to the both of you for sharing your thoughts and your introspect on this important matter. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric.
Ted Schroeder and Glynn Tonsor, livestock economists at Kansas State University, on COVID-19 and the ensuing impact on our meatpacking industry on Agriculture Today. And we'll be back with more on the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. In today's agricultural news headlines, these courtesy in part by DTN, the disparity between live cattle prices and boxed beef prices is now drawing more attention as the USDA's boxed beef cutout values moved above $4 a pound on Monday and continued upward yesterday, with choice at nearly $4.29 a pound, select at $4.11 a pound. Until last week, the record boxed beef price was $2.65 $1.05 a pound way back in 2015. Cattle slaughter last week at 425,000 head, down 8% from the last week of April, nearly 37% below the same time a year ago. And pork processing last week at 1.54 million head, down 22% from a week earlier, 35% below last year. Now, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has recommended that packing plants follow CDC guidelines to protect their workers, and Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue said last week that the USDA is working with plans to help them get back online, but the department has not detailed how exactly it's helping the industry in that regard. On Monday, Cargill was forced to shut down a plant in Nebraska for 2 weeks. That plant normally processes about 4,500 head of cattle a week. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention cite that COVID-19 outbreaks have hit at least 115 meat and poultry plants now. At the same time, calls are increasing for investigations into the price disparity in the cattle markets and the industry concentration as well. Yesterday, 11 state attorneys general called on U.S. Attorney General William Barr and the Department of Justice to investigate market concentration and competition in the cattle industry. The Attorney General cited that live cattle futures prices have hit 18-year lows, while the price of boxed beef again remains high. The letter reads that given the concentrated market structure of the beef industry, it may be particularly susceptible to market manipulation, particularly during times of food insecurity, such as the current COVID-19 crisis, again in the letter to William Barr. States, not the only ones who have asked the Department of Justice to investigate cattle markets. Several senators last month wrote a similar letter. The USDA began investigating cattle markets last summer following the market divergence after that fire at the Tyson plant at Holcomb in southwest Kansas. The USDA has said it is expanding that departmental investigation. And the spotlight on the cattle industry comes as retailers also are increasingly seeking to ration meat supplies. Several major retailers are now curbing purchases of meat. Hy-Vee, the Iowa-based grocery chain with 264 stores in 8 states, including Kansas, announced that effective today, that company will limit meat purchases at its stores to any combination of 4 meat packages. Tyson Foods warned that the coronavirus pandemic would disrupt its business for months to come, reducing its meat production, cutting into supplies for grocery stores and restaurants. Tyson's efforts to keep plants operating, including chartering planes to deliver protective masks and setting up mobile health clinics, are adding to their costs that impact already registering at Tyson. On Monday, the company reported overall profit fell 15% to $364 million for the quarter ending on March the 28th, during which supermarket shopping ramped up and restaurant visits fell. The company said it could not project profitability for the remainder of the fiscal year. The Small Business Administration has reopened processing of new economic injury disaster loans and idle advance applications on a limited basis to only provide relief for U.S. agricultural businesses now. Those businesses include those engaged in the production of food and fiber, ranching, raising of livestock, aquaculture, and all other farming and agricultural-related industries. The SBA, to follow up with more on this, is encouraging all eligible agricultural businesses with 500 or fewer employees wishing to apply to begin preparing their business financial information needed for that application. Virtual meetings are scheduled between the United States and the United Kingdom negotiators the next 2 weeks as efforts pick up to craft a bilateral trade agreement between the two countries. The USDA's Rod Bain has more.
They will be virtual negotiations for the time being. At Tuesday, a virtual plenary panel visit between negotiating teams from the U.S. and the United Kingdom kicked off what is expected to be 2 weeks of meetings designed to craft a trade agreement between the two nations. U.S. Trade Representative's Office Chief Ag Negotiator Greg Dowd in February said talks would begin.
Once we get the negotiating objectives out of them, we'll be ready to go.
with the UK formalizing those objectives in March. A USTR press release states the negotiations will be conducted on an accelerated pace. Reports state subsequent meetings will take place every 6 weeks after this opening round of negotiations, with the end goal of an agreement reached by year's end. Increasing market access of U.S. ag goods into the United Kingdom remains a top priority for our nation's negotiators in crafting a trade deal. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Although the coronavirus has upended several long-held traditions, Beef Month and the many contributions of those in the beef community will not be overlooked. Scarlett Higgins reports that, if anything, the pandemic has put a spotlight on the vital role those in food production play in the stability of the nation.
To celebrate Beef Month during May, the Kansas Beef Council will be providing consumers with beef facts, tasty grilling recipes, beef nutrition information, and virtual ranch tours. In order to accomplish the latter, producers across the state donned GoPro video cameras and opened their operations and homes to give consumers a behind-the-scenes look at a day in the life of a Kansas rancher. The first virtual tour was launched May 1st and features the Isaac and Jill Carr family from Junction City who ranch and own a feed yard. These videos provide an opportunity to connect with consumers and deliver an accurate picture of how cattle are raised by meeting some of the families that care for them on a daily basis. According to Kansas Beef Council Chairman Dan Harris, the videos and Beef Month in general are a testimony to the hard work that never stops for Kansas beef producers. He commends his fellow cattlemen and cattlewomen for their resiliency in trying times and their uncanny ability to triumph in the face of adversity. The videos will be posted throughout the month of May on the Kansas Beef Council Facebook page, YouTube, and Instagram accounts. Just search for Kansas Beef on each platform to find the account. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
And that's what we find on today's agricultural news page. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Looking up into the still bare tree, I can see a few buttonballs still hanging on the branches.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
It's a year ago that lightning struck the tree. I was downstairs working at my computer, and Anneke, my wife, rose a foot from the couch. She was close to the Big Bang and lightning flash. The tree stands only 7 yards away from the house, and its branches reach over the roof. When we bought the house 46 years ago, it was still a small tree, about 8 feet tall. Today, the tree is tall, with 18-inch diameter at chest height and 64 inches circumference. The tree was well placed by the former owner. It provides shade for the parked cars. As it grew, I've removed a few lower branches. It's a London plane tree. You can call it a sycamore or American plane tree. The native tree grows along our streams and creeks. I have an old and beautiful tree growing along the edge of a small field on the farm. But the tree here, close to the house, holds meaning, as it is the welcoming tree. When you drive up the hill and park, you are under the tree. I have collected each year a few of the seed pod buttonballs and have germinated seeds to grow small trees of this now big tree. Some of the children have 1 or 2 small seedlings, which are now growing. It's funny. I do not follow the growing instructions, but yet I'm very successful. I have already collected a few of last year's seed pods to try to grow more seedlings this year. Looking up into the still bare tree, I can see a few buttonballs hanging on the branches. Yes, the tree is still bare. I do see a few advantageous buds along the thick trunk showing small green leaves. But up in the crown, it's hard to see. I will go and look with my binoculars. Hopefully, I will see some greening. I'm worried. After the lightning struck the tree, the bark split down the trunk. It's an inch wide and about a half-inch deep. At top and bottom, the strip is still attached like a long cord, attached on both ends. But you can lift it away from the tree carefully like a guitar string. Last summer, after the lightning strike, I kept looking at the tree to see if leaves would die. Oh, some came down. But the tree stayed green. I was thankful. During the winter, I kept looking for dying branches, but all was well. I hoped. Of course, this spring would be the moment to know. Would the tree leave out? Early spring, I thought I noticed buds swelling. But that could be stored energy. But there was no bursting of leaves. Okay, we've had the cold spell with the late freeze. If anything, it surely did not help. However, some buds are breaking. It may be the last gasp, a death struggle. I must see and wait. I would miss the tree. My oldest son and I looked at it, both of us figuring out, if we must, how to drop it. But it is too early for that. I'm still hoping, trusting that the tree won't let the old man in. The tree is way too young for that. A sycamore tree can grow several hundreds of years old. At best, the tree is 55 to 60 years. It's still a youngster now, of good size. One fall, I planted hundreds of tulips underneath it. I scratched the loose soil away until I hit hard, dry soil. I raked leaves away to the side. Then I planted the bulbs thick in groups, the grouping nearly touching each other. With the several hundreds of tulips planted on the soil carpet, I covered them with the earth and leaf mulch, which I topped off with 4 inches of wood chips for a winter blanket and proper depth. There was no way I could have dug up the hard, packed soil under that tree. It worked. Next spring, there was a gorgeous display of tulips under the tree. My sycamore tree is not famous, but it surely is loved and appreciated. In the book, America's Famous and Historic Trees by Jeffrey Meyer, 3 sycamores are described as famous trees. The first one is the Berkeley plantation sycamore. Other famous trees are sycamore descendants of the seeds which went to the moon on the 3rd lunar mission. On return, the seeds were germinated. One tree stands on the ground of Mississippi State University. Another tree with a great story is a descendant of the White Plains sycamore under which George Washington had camped. A 15 feet tall seedling of that tree was taken to Moscow, Russia, and donated at the first May Day in 1991. That May Day was about democracy, not the emphasis on the military parade. The Russians wanted to emphasize peace. The tree donated was a symbol. I am so glad we had a good rain. Adequate moisture is the best I can give my suffering tree.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. Our time's away once again. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.